For my video on Genesis 1, we know Enki as this subterranean freshwater god from ancient Sumer, and through the halupu tree and its environment, the metaphor of a shepherd cult is developed. While people may interpret Enki as semen represented by pure water, which seriously, check Wikipedia if you don't believe me, but he is the ecosystem that produces a fresh purified water from which the willow tree will drink up with its roots, and in return grow and cast an even larger shadow or shade, attracting even more sheep to potentially steal away. The tree drinks from the water, which we can understand as a gene pool of suitable women. Analyzing further, we can understand Enki as this progenitor of shepherd cults who wish to tap into the resources and grow their flock by attaining access to the pure water or females. These shepherd cults act as the managerial class of society, looking over the flock at large and maintaining order, progress as the higher-ups see fit. Like the prehistoric Semitic nomadic shepherds, Enki waits in the reeds for an unsuspecting female with suitable traits to steal away from the herd, to mate with his stud to further the line and grow the flock or his cult and spread influence. Out of this prehistoric phenomena, we see the development of a sophisticated symbolism to create this water cult and eventually shepherd cults. And this developed over time from the Semitic Akkadians of southwest Mesopotamia who came from nomadic shepherds. We might initially think of Enki as Poseidon, but I argue he is the source of a variety of gods, such as Hephaestus, Poseidon, the Cyclopes, Oceanus, and Prometheus, and as the origin and host of a host of motifs and themes present in Near East and European mythology at large. In my video on Genesis 1, I argue we can identify Enki as a Cyclopes whom, at their mother's request, rise up from their arrested state in a subterranean lair or dungeon, which in the Greek myths we know as Tartarus, and in the Sumerian myths as the Apsu. And it's all similar where in the Greek myths the Cyclopes are released from Tartarus by their mother Gaia in order to have Cronus declared ruler after his castration, and then sent right back down after. And from the Sumerian myths we have an identical tale from Enki and Ninmah, where we learn of Namu, this Gaia-like figure, voicing her discontent with the current ruling regime of the time, and decides to create new gods to free the senior gods from their toil. We also know she beckons her son Enki from the deep Apsu, a water abyss, which we can understand as Tartarus, and Enki as a Cyclopes being released. And I get this reading from the text of the poem Enki and Ninmah. Enki and Ninmah, lines 1 through 11. In those days, in the days when heaven and earth were created, in those nights, in the nights when heaven and earth were created, in those years, in the years when the fates were determined, when the gods of Anu were born, when the goddesses were taken in marriages, when the goddesses were distributed in heaven and earth, when the goddesses became pregnant and gave birth, when the goddesses were obliged their food and dining halls, the senior gods oversaw the work, while the minor gods were bearing the toil. The gods were digging the canals and piling up the silt in the Harali. The gods, crushing the clay, began complaining about this life. Lines 12 through 23. At that time, the one of great wisdom, the creator of all the senior gods, Enki lay on his bed, not waking up from his sleep, in the deep Apsu, in the subterranean water, the place the inside of which no other god knows. The god said, weeping, "He is the cause of the lamenting." Namu, the primeval mother who gave birth to the senior gods, took the tears of the gods to the one who lay sleeping, the one who did not wake up from his bed, to her son. "Are you really lying there asleep, and not awake? The gods, your creatures, are smashing there. My son, wake up from your bed. Please, apply the skill deriving from your wisdom and create a substitute for the gods so they can be freed from their toil." Lines 24 through 37. At the word of his mother Namu, Enki rose up from his bed, his room for pondering. He slapped his thigh in annoyance. The wise and intelligent one, the prudent of skills, the fashioner of the design of everything, brought to life birth goddesses. Enki reached out his arm over them and turned his attention to them. And after Enki, the fashioner of designs by himself, had pondered the matter, he said to his mother Namu, "My mother, the creature you planned will really come into existence. Impose on him the work of carrying baskets. You should knead clay from the top of the Apsu. The birth goddesses will nip off the clay, and you shall bring the form into existence." In the Sumerian poem Enki and Ninmah, Enki is woken up from his sleep in the Apsu, a deep subterranean space, in order to change the dynamics of the current ruling hierarchy. He's going to put in motion this revolution of a new generation of gods to free the older gods from their everyday responsibilities and toil. We can interpret this rising discontent as the same feelings of Gaia when she plotted to have Uranus castrated and overthrown by Cronus, all because she was upset that her children, the Cyclopes, were locked up by Uranus in Tartarus. And like Enki and Ninmah, Gaia wished to usher in a new era with the Titan generation to now lord over the earth. And we know this from many sources: Hesiod's Theogony and Apollodorus Bibliotheca or History, the best examples, and all read from the latter. From Bibliotheca, Apollodorus, Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 1. Sky, or Uranus, was the first who ruled over the whole world, and having wedded Earth, or Gaia, he begat first the 100-handed, as they are named, who were unsurpassed in size and might, each of them having 100 hands and 50 heads. Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 2. After these, Earth bore him the Cyclopes, to wit, of whom each had one eye in his head. But them Sky bound and cast into Tartarus, a gloomy place in Hades, as far distant from Earth as Earth is distant from the sky. Once again, we can think of Tartarus as the Apsu, this aquifer, where Enki is lying dormant, and the 100-handed ones can be interpreted as the malformed gods that Enki and Ninmah create in the poem. I won't read from it, but if you keep reading the poem Enki and Ninmah, the new gods they create from clay can't eat or talk and are generally monstrous, kind of like the 100-handed ones. And like Hesiod and Apollodorus, who I just read from, Uranus is the chief god at the beginning, like the Sumerian god Anu in the poem Enki and Ninmah. This sky father is mentioned in the first lines, and it's no coincidence because it's a creation story in itself. Reading furthermore, we get to the castration and eventual overthrow of Uranus by Cronus. It was a release to the Cyclopes that cements the legitimacy of Cronus' rule. From Apollodorus, Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 4. But Earth, grieved at the destruction of her children, who had been cast into Tartarus, persuaded the Titans to attack their father, and gave Cronus a sickle. And they, all but Ocean, attacked him, and Cronus cut off his father's genitals and threw them into the sea. And from the drops of the flowing blood were born the Furies, and having dethroned their father, they brought up their brethren, the Cyclopes, who had been hurled down into Tartarus, and committed the sovereignty to Cronus. We can understand the rising of the Cyclopes, or Enki from the subterranean waters, as symbolism we see associated with chthonic gods, and ultimately the symbolism can be incorporated into the larger metaphor or themes of seasonality and sexual reproduction. It's easy to imagine the rising from the dormant underground, in Enki's case, an aquifer, as an allegory for the womb and the eventual birth of a child. And like all the symbols and themes, we can analyze them on a surface level and reflect on them as individuals, or we can go even further and understand them like on a civilizational scope as well, right? And with Enki, we see the rise of a new order or hierarchy and power dynamics, and he is one of the foundational pillars or building blocks of this change. And this changing of the guards is a present theme in both Sumerian and Greek mythos, where the birth of a new child can usher in the end of an old reign and start of a new age. And we can recognize these themes through the chthonic symbolism of seasonality and metals associated with time periods like the Bronze Age and Iron Age, as well as the mythological times of the Gold and Silver Age. And after Uranus was castrated, Gaia had the Cyclopes released from Tartarus to enforce the shift of power to Cronus. But immediately after this, Cronus had a Cyclope sent right back down to Tartarus, and it wasn't until Zeus released them again to fight on the Olympian side in the Titan War. And once again, you have the theme of the Cyclopes rising from underneath the earth and pushing the scales to one side and finishing off one power and stalling another. Apollodorus, Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 4. And having dethroned their father, they brought up their brethren, who had been hurled down to Tartarus, and committed the sovereignty to Cronus, where the brethren is a reference to the Cyclopes. Apollodorus, Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 5. But Cronus again bound and shut them up in Tartarus, and wedded his sister Rhea. Moving further, Apollodorus, Book 1, Chapter 2, Section 1. But when Zeus was full grown, he took Metis, daughter of Ocean, to help him. And she gave Cronus a drug to swallow, which forced him to disgorge first the stone, and then the children whom he had swallowed. And with their aid, Zeus waged the war against Cronus and the Titans. They fought for 10 years, and Earth prophesied victory to Zeus if he should have allies, those who had been hurled down to Tartarus. So he slew their jailers Campe and loosed their bonds. And the Cyclopes then gave Zeus thunder and lightning and a thunderbolt. And on Pluto they bestowed a helmet, and on Poseidon a trident. Armed with these weapons, the gods overcame the Titans, shut them up in Tartarus, and appointed 100 handers their guards. But they themselves cast lots for the sovereignty, and to Zeus was allotted the dominion of the sky, to Poseidon the dominion of the sea, and to Pluto the dominion in Hades. Another interesting Sumerian poem is the epic Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, where in the epic, Enki sets sail for the underworld when the Hulupu tree has been blown away. Just like how the Cyclopes are sent to the underworld, or Tartarus, right when Cronus was named ruler after the castration of Uranus. Likewise, we can understand that moment as the castration of the god Anu, symbolized by the sweeping away of the Hulupu tree, branches, roots, and all, by the Euphrates as well as the south wind. And this Hulupu tree symbolizes the penis or genetic line of the Sumerian sky god Anu, the equivalent of the Greek god Uranus. And from the blood and semen of the castration, we know from the Greek myths we get the Furies, Venus, and the giants. And another similarity is a story where Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon each cast lots, which was written about by Homer, Apollodorus, and Hesiod. And this claim of casting lots for individual dominions within the universe is nearly identical to the beginning of the poem of Gilgamesh. So let's read from it. Gilgamesh, Enkidu, in the Netherworld. Lines 1 through 26. In those days, in those distant days, in those nights, in those remote nights, in those years, in those distant years, in the days of yore, when the necessary things had been brought into manifest existence, when the heavens had been separated from the earth, when the earth had been delimited from the heavens, when the fame of mankind had been established, when An had taken the heavens for himself, when Enlil had taken the earth from himself, when the netherworld had been given to Ereshkigal as a gift, when Enki set sail for the netherworld, against the king a storm of small hailstones arose. Against Enki a storm of large hailstones arose. The small ones were light hammers, the large ones were like stones from catapults. The keel of Enki's little boat was trembling, as if it were being butted by turtles. The waves at the bow of the boat arose to devour the king like wolves, and the waves at the stern of the boat were attacking Enki like a lion. Furthermore, lines 27 through 35. At that time there was a single tree, a single hoopoe tree, growing on the bank of the pure Euphrates, being watered by the Euphrates. The force of the south wind uprooted it, and stripped its branches, and the Euphrates picked it up, and carried it away. A woman, respectful of An and Enlil's words, was walking along, and took the tree, and brought it into Uruk, and to Inanna's luxuriant garden. So when the hoopoe tree is blown down, Enki is seen sailing to the underworld. One possible interpretation of this would be while he's sailing, he's being attacked by hailstones and caught up in a violent sea of waves. So we can imagine that the hailstones and attacks on Enki are like the Furies as well as the giants that were born from the semen and blood of Uranus's castration. And the waves and river are tossing about amid the chaos and violence, and this is like we imagine the birth of Venus, with the froth or the foam in the sea, and the wind blowing, and this beautiful woman appearing, and that is how we see it in Gilgamesh with Inanna. She comes in and she grabs the hulupu tree from the river and carries it with her to Uruk. And this has actual historical relevance, whereas in Greek it's purely mythological. The Cyclopes are written to be some of the earliest existing gods to ever spring into existence, born shortly before the Titans and second after the 100-handed ones. And this is likewise to how we know Enki, both mythologically in addition to archaeologically. Eridu is the oldest city in Sumer, dating back to 5400 BC, and there at Eridu they worship Enki at the Iabatu temple, or water aquifer temple. So like the Cyclopes, Enki is there at the beginning of creation of Sumerian mythology, but in addition he's as well there archaeologically. We also know that the Sumerian sky god Anu was worshipped at the city of Uruk as far back as 4000 BC, and eventually waning in worship with the eventual conquering of Sumer under the Semitic Akkadian Empire. And we can understand the Epic of Gilgamesh as this metaphorical account of the Akkadians under Sargon of Akkad ascending over the sky god worshipping Sumerians, with the incoming goddess Inanna and the god Enlil supplanting Anu as the chief god. And Enlil can be considered as the equivalent of Kronos, and it's symbolic that Inanna takes the blown away tree to Uruk, the seat of worship of the chief god, the sky father Anu. And this is how we know the myth of Uranus and Cronus in Greek mythology as well, where in the Greek myth, it's an obviously later interpretation of this actual worship of a sky god from Sumer, and it's more of an explication of the parable of the castrated or supplanted ruler. It's pretty obvious that Uranus was never the chief god like in Sumer, as there's no evidence of worship to the Cyclopes or Uranus in Greece. But in Sumer, we have temples to both Enki and Anu dating to the 5th century BC. Moreover, we can think of the Titan War and the victory of the Olympians in the same manner, with the son overthrowing his father, and it was through the help of the Cyclopes, gods around since the beginning of the universe. So according to Apollodorus, the Titan War lasted 10 years, like Homer's Iliad and Sack of Troy, and I see the 10 years as the length of months a pregnancy could take, if going by the lunar calendar. I interpret the numbers 7, 8, 9, and 10 as the months a birth could occur, much like we see today with the average gestation around 9 months. But certainly this could occur a month or two early, and we can imagine this allegory for a birth as the men inside the Trojan horse climbing out and finally being able to open the gates of Troy, and the fall of this old and great power and the resulting changing of the guard to the Greeks, much like the rise of Enki or the Cyclopes, as a metaphor for the birth and symbol of this revolutionary mechanism. Combine this with the evidence that both Enki and the Cyclopes are known for their smithcraft, cunning, and workmanship, and we can be fairly certain that we're drawing correct conclusions about these two seemingly different mythos being related to one another. From Apollodorus, it was only through the help of the Cyclopes that Zeus and his brothers Hades and Poseidon were able to overcome defeat. Because of the Cyclopes and their craftsmanship, right? Making Zeus his thunderbolt, Pluto his helmet of invisibility, and Poseidon his trident. And in similar fashion, in the Sumerian poem Enki and the World Order, we see Enki as this crafty god, around at the beginning of creation, who brings the end to an old power and is fundamental in the triumph of the new order. Argue the poem is nearly identical to Genesis 1, Day 6 in particular. In fact, all these Sumerian poems are creation myths in themselves, really. Enki counts the days and months and years, it says, which I interpret as this beginning of a new era, similar to how we start this new nomenclature for timekeeping based off before and after Christ's birth. So like the rising of Enki brings legitimacy to this new era, and from then on the days begin to be counted, and likewise for the rise of the Cyclopes beginning the reigns and sovereignty of Cronus and Zeus. I'll read from Enki in the World Order, lines 17 through 31. Counting the days and putting the months in their houses, so as to complete the years and submit the completed years to the assembly for a decision, taking decisions to regularize the days. Father Enki, you are the king of the assembled people. Furthermore, lines 38 through 47. Enlil, the great mountain, has commissioned you to gladden the hearts of lords and rulers and wish them well. Enki, Lord of prosperity, Lord of wisdom, Lord the beloved of An, the ornament of Eridu, who established commands and decisions, who well understands the decreeing of fates, you close up the days and make the months enter their house. You bring down, you have reached their number, you make the people dwell in their dwelling places, you make them follow their herdsmen. Further along in the poem, Enki describes the new gods and decrees their roles in which to take over for the older gods in this more modern and complex world. And these new gods are equivalent to the Olympian gods from the Greek myths. And in doing so, the poem follows along, line by line, describing each one of the new gods and their responsibilities and attributes, and in doing so establishes natural order of the world that we can recognize, all but giving them their lightning bolt, right? For example, the storm god Iskar, the equivalent of Zeus in Greek mythology, is described in lines 309 through 317. He called to the rain of the heavens, he as floating clouds, he made, rising at the horizon. He turned the mountains into fields. Enki placed in charge of this all of him who rides on the great storms, who attacks with lightning bolts, the holy bar, which blocks the entrance to the interior of heaven, the son of An, the canal inspector of heaven and earth, Isker, the bringer of plenty, the son of An. Furthermore, the Cyclopes had a folklore with the Greeks and Romans after the late Bronze Age collapse, credited with the construction of the Cyclopean walls of Mycenaean Greece. Cyclopean masonry is a type of stonework found in Mycenaean architecture built with massive limestone boulders, where the term comes from the belief of classical Greeks that only the mythical Cyclopes had the strength to move these enormous boulders that made up the walls of Mycenae and others. Pliny's Natural History reported that the tradition was attributed to Aristotle, that the Cyclopes were the inventors of masonry towers, giving rise to the designation Cyclopean. And Mycenaean Greece was the last phase of the Bronze Age in ancient Greece, spanning the period from approximately 1600 to 1100 BC, which of course is nearly 900 to 400 years before Homer and around 1,000 years before the time of Aristotle during the classical period. And from Hellenistic myths, the Cyclopes are said to have built the first altar that was sworn upon by Zeus and the other Olympians in alliance before the Titan War. And this altar was later sent into the heavens, where we know it is the constellation Ara. And the Temple of Enki is also mentioned in the myths as well, like in Enki's journey to Nippur, where Enki builds his temple in Eridu on the first day of creation, like in Genesis 1 I argue, after rising from the Apsu, and in doing so creates day and night. And the temple itself is a metaphor for the sky and the earth that holds up the sky, anchored in the Apsu, or as we know from Greek, Tartarus, and this is described by the poem. So let's read. Enki's journey to Nippur, lines 1 through 8. In those remote days when the fates were determined, in a year when An brought about abundance, and people broke through the earth like herbs and plants, then the lord of the Apsu, King Enki the lord who determines the fate, built up his temple entirely from silver and lapis lazuli, and silver and lapis lazuli were the shining daylight. Into the shrine of the Apsu he brought joy. Lines 9 through 17. An artfully made bright crenellation rising out from the Apsu was erected for Lord Enki. He built the temple from precious metal, decorated it with lapis lazuli, and covered it abundantly with gold. In Eridu, he built his house on the bank. Its brickwork makes utterance and gives advice. Its eaves roar like a bull. The temple of Enki bellows. During the night, the temple praises its Lord, and it offers its best for him. This is like the other creation story, Enki and Ninmah, where here new people break from the earth, like herbs and plants, it says, like from the clay in the other poem, Enki and Ninmah. And this coincides with Enki rising up or building up his temple of gold and silver and lapis lazuli, right, these precious metals and materials like ages of men, from the Apsu. And once again we had the same types of themes with the seasonality of plants or civilization associated with these chthonic gods rising up and the changing of the guard to the new gods from the old gods. The new is mentioned in the beginning and it's not explicitly stated, but we can infer from our knowledge of the poem Gilgamesh and a metaphor of the Hulupu tree and understand that the structure of the creation story has a new listed first and then it's Enki. We need to really read between the lines then. There's a changing of the guard in between there, and we know Anu is castrated, and it's Enki who builds the temple. This monument or symbol of the new order or age of man construction out of gold and silver. Furthermore, reading into Enki's journey to Nippur, lines 26 to 32. Your lock has no rival, your bolt is a fearsome lion. Your roof beams are the bowl of heaven, and artfully made bright headgear. Your reed mats are like lapis lazuli, decorating the roof beams. Your vault is a bull, raising its horns. Your door is a lion who seizes a man. Your staircase is a lion coming down on a man. Lines 33 through 43. Apsu, pure place which fulfills its purpose. Your Lord has directed his step towards you. Enki, Lord of the Apsu, has embellished your foundation pegs with cornelian. He has adorned you with lapis lazuli. The temple of Enki is provisioned with holy wax. It's a bull obedient to its master, roaring by itself, and giving advice at the same time, which Enki has surrounded with the holy reed fence. In your midst, a lofty throne is erected. Your door jamb is the holy locking bar of heaven. And with these lines, Enki creates the sky and stars, and his temple holds it up upon the earth as the lock bar, which is like the Hellenistic myth where the Cyclopes create the first altar in heaven. And it's from this craftiness and smith work we see a similarity to Hephaestus. We also know from the Olympian version of the Cyclopes they are the assistants to Hephaestus deep in the volcano of Mount Etna. And interestingly, in the Sumerian poem Enki and the World Order, Enki decrees a god to be his master builder, no doubt a Hephaestus-like character. From Enki and the World Order, lines 341 to 348. He tied down the strings and coordinated them with the foundations, and with the power of the assembly, he planned a house and performed the purification rituals. The great prince put down the foundations and laid the bricks. Enki placed in charge of all this, whose foundations once laid do not sag, whose good houses once built do not collapse, whose vaults reach up into the heart of the heavens like a rainbow. Mukdama, Enlil's master builder. And there's even an Orphic tradition that seems to suggest that the Cyclopes taught Hephaestus craft. From the Orphic fragment 179. The Cyclopes gave to Zeus thunder, and they made him the thunderbolt. And they taught Hephaestus and Athena all the crafts. Whereas later on it became accepted that the Cyclopes are the assistants to Hephaestus deep in the volcano forges of Mount Etna, like the 3rd century BC poet Camillus and the 1st century BC Roman poet Virgil. Camillus has the Cyclopes make Artemis's bows, arrows, and quiver, just as they had made those of Apollo. The 1st century BC Roman poet Virgil seems to combine the Cyclopes of Hesiod with those of Homer, having them live alongside each other in the same part of Sicily. In his Latin epic, the Aeneid, Virgil has the Cyclopes work an extensive network of caverns, stretching from Mount Etna to the Aeolian Islands. As the assistants of the smith god Vulcan, they forge various items for the gods, thunderbolts for Jupiter, a chariot for Mars, and armor for Minerva or Athena, which again is like Enki decreeing the new god's responsibilities in the poem Enki and the World Order. I argue the Aeneid, or Homer's 2 epics, are creation myths themselves that explain almost all the gods' origins, but are narrative-driven, so it takes 48-odd books or 24 books in whatever case. And we see Hephaestus have this similar role in the Iliad, when he makes Achilles his new armor, and he's known as making the staff which Agamemnon possesses as rightful heir of Argos and the Achaeans. Like the Cyclopes of the Titan War make Zeus his thunderbolt as well as Pluto's helmet and Poseidon's trident. Hephaestus there to make new crafts for the gods or the demigods and the heroes in the Trojan War. There to help bring down the old civilization by supplying their craft and workmanship and bringing order and responsibilities and building a new civilization from the start and be there in its foundation. And we can interpret this changing of the ages or guards through metaphor of a crafty, smithy god. And along with that, we have the symbolism of the caverns, once again being allegories for pregnancy and human maturity like Ovid describes, and the seasonality of civilizations, but also the theme of metallurgy in the ages of men, like Hesiod describes. And we know Enki and the Cyclopes and Hephaestus are all chthonic gods that we can associate with them with volcanoes or caves, Tartarus or the Apsu, or some kind of underground depth or lair. And we know, of course, metals are mined from beneath the ground and worked in these smith shops around hearts of fire and the furnaces, which we can assume the fire-lit caves and volcanoes are metaphorical for these smithy furnaces and workshops. And probably the most popular conception of the Cyclopes is the lone Cyclops, Polyphemus, who Odysseus and his men visit when they are forced under distress from the gods to land on the island of the Cyclopes, which is in modern-day Sicily. And Homer describes the island as this pristine land where only wild goats and the sheep the Cyclopes herd exist, and they live off the earth, eating what grains and fruit grow wild. But it's not to say the island is barren or in other circumstances wouldn't be productive, because it's quite the opposite. And this is the context that Homer adds with the following verses, explaining specifically how for one example, how grapes would do excellently there, as Odysseus exclaims. From Book 9 of Homer's Odyssey. We sailed hence, always in much distress, till we came to the land of the lawless and inhuman Cyclopes. Now the Cyclopes neither plant nor plough, but trust in Providence, and live on such wheat, barley, and grapes as grow wild, without any kind of tillage. And their wild grapes yield them wine, as the sun and the rain may grow them. They have no laws nor assemblies of the people, but live in caves on the top of the high mountains. Each is lord and master in his family, and they take no account of their neighbors. Now off their harbor there lies a wooded and fertile island, not quite close to the land of the Cyclopes, but still not far. It is overrun with wild goats, that breed there in great numbers, and are never disturbed by foot of man. For sportsmen, who as a rule suffer so much hardship in forest or among mountain precipices, do not go there, nor yet again is it ever plowed or fed down, but it lies as wilderness, untilled and unsown from year to year, and has no living thing upon it but only goats. For the Cyclopes have no ships, nor yet shipwrights who could make them ships for them. They cannot therefore go from city to city, or sail over the sea to one another's country, as people who have ships can do. If they had had these, they would have colonized the island, for it is a very good one, and one would yield everything in due season. There are meadows that in some places come right down to the seashore, well watered and full of luscious grass. Grapes would do there excellently. There is level land for plowing, and would always yield heavily at harvest time. For the soil is deep. There is a good harbor, where no cables are wanted, nor yet anchors, nor need a ship be moored, but all one has to do is to beach one's vessel, and stay there till the wind comes be fair for putting out to sea again. At the head of the harbor there is a spring of clear water coming out of a cave, and there are poplars growing all around it. I understand this as an allegory to the Garden of Eden, or this prehistoric time we can associate with Enki, and especially the poem Enki and Ninmah. And that's what I plan to make a more in-depth video going over the actual text of Genesis 2 and Enki and Ninmah in a line-by-line comparison. But in short, we can imagine the Cyclopes living in this prehistoric island paradise, free of any disturbances of the gods or men, lost in time, this Garden of Eden. And as I already described in the beginning of this video about Enki being the progenitor of these shepherd cults, and this theme of herding sheep comes from Semitic Akkadians of southwest Mesopotamia who were nomadic herders, and the habitat of the willow tree or hulupu tree becomes symbolic of Enki and the influence of him in this new cult. The willow tree creates a microhabitat with the shade and purified water, attracting herds of animals to gather, and making the prospect of stealing them to grow your own flock easy pickings. And this kind of behavior, tracking down women and stealing them away from the marshes and river banks to impregnate them, is what we see from Enki in the poem Enki and Ninmah, and it's an obvious metaphor for the strategy to spread their influence through the acquisition of suitable female specimens to breed and grow their flock or cult, whatever, right? Again, just think of the civilizational aspect as well as the individual cases of the strategy being deployed. And in Homer's description of the island of the Cyclopes in the Odyssey, he mentions this fresh water source emanating from a cave, and there are poplar trees on the banks, which I interpret as Enki and the fresh water god who comes from the Apsu, the subterranean aquifer, and the poplar trees as the hulupu trees or willow trees, and the banks and river beds are the natural habitat of Enki, right? And like in the poem Enki and Ninmah, in the beginning, Enki is in this pristine paradise, but there is only salt water. And if they had fresh water, they could have this wondrous city of people and animals, like the island that Odysseus describes. But the Cyclopes don't have a ship to reach the island to colonize it. And if we analyze further, we can see that Odysseus himself is like a Jesus or Moses-like figure who essentially circumcises Polyphemus, establishing this covenant with God. And if you go further, from the Euripides play Cyclopes, Odysseus prays to Hephaestus and basically has this covenant with Hephaestus to poke the eye of the Cyclops out with this olive branch. And you can go even further to relate this to the Sumerian poem Enki and Inanna, where Inanna gets the god Enki into a drunken stupor and steals his mace. And then she escapes just in time as Enki realizes he's being tricked, and then Enki tries to get back Inanna and the mace. But each stop of her trip back to Uruk, she fights off these demons or monsters that Enki sends, and finally she makes it off with Enki's mace to Uruk. And in Sumerian mythology, mace is like one of the decrees of the divine that is foundational to their social institutions and religious practices and behaviors and morals. And it's not always like this physical object, like such as like a musical instrument, but a lot of times it's like a technology like basket weaving, or even abstractions like victory, heroship, destruction of cities, falsehood, anonymity. And this is like Odysseus getting the Cyclopes drunk and making off with his sheep in the glory of wounding and escaping Polyphemus, along with all his other exploits, right? It just adds to it. And he goes around the Mediterranean in his boat like Inanna, making stops and growing his reputation and resume for cunning and craft, collecting each story and glory. And on a lighter side, or funny side, you wonder if the Greeks made the Cyclopes literally one-eyed monsters as a joke, like intentionally. Because after reading Enki and Ninmah, you get to see the shepherd cult in action. And Enki's like this frisky guy. He doesn't take no for an answer. He'll grab you right out of the reeds like you're a nice sheep. He's trying to grow his flock. And it's wonder if they just kind of made the Cyclopes these like penises, like these one-eyed monsters. And like I said, it reminds me, Odysseus kind of like circumcises this Polyphemus and makes a covenant with God, like Moses or some figure in the Old Testament. And the Sumerian myth is way more explicit and leaves nothing to the imagination as far as like sexual intercourse or like even rape, as opposed to like the vaguer Semitic mystery cults like Christianity. And we know this is most likely a conscious and learned thing, probably after some pushback and exiles, that they should synthesize this more mysterious and cryptic mythos that isn't as easily interpreted, right? Like to identify Enki as this one-eyed monster who needs to be like isolated on this island that he can't colonize anymore. He can't spread his religion, right? And we see that today, that with this censorship, but also with Christianity and the first commandment, that this effort to control the information has to keep people in the dark and therefore not a threat to power. And if the Greeks understood this like emasculation theme in the Sumerian myth and made Enki this Cyclope, this one-eyed monster, it would be pretty hilarious. And I'd like to think that they at least were sophisticated enough to do this. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video looking at the Sumerian god Enki and the Greek gods, the Cyclopes. And be on the lookout for my next video looking at Enki and Hephaestus. And hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. See you!